There are a number of scenarios that we can think of when it comes to building client applications on Windows. There are the single technology applications. So for example, we build a Windows Forms application that uses only Windows Forms controls. Or we use a WPF application that uses only WPF controls. But what we want to talk about here is mixed technology applications, because we're going to see how you can write a Windows Forms application that uses both Windows Forms and WPF controls, and on the flip side, WPF applications that use both WPF and Windows Forms controls. Now, why would you do such a thing? Well, there's a huge benefit to reuse rather than recreate from scratch. So you have a number of existing Windows Forms, forms, and controls. Why rewrite them all from scratch in your WPF applications? Why not just reuse them? As you write newer WPF windows and controls, there are benefits to going back and using those in existing Windows Forms applications. And another reason you'd use Interop is because it's an easy way to add missing functionality rather than build your own controls or go out and purchase third-party controls. So for example, WPF does not have the masked text box, but Windows Forms has one, so you can't use the Windows Forms masked text box in a WPF window. WPF has much better graphics capabilities than Windows Forms, so if you want to add better graphics capabilities to your Windows Forms applications, you might want to use WPF. And then the WPF containership model gives you an easy way of building better looking user interfaces, so list boxes that have images and text in them. You can't do that in Windows Forms, but you can easily do it in WPF. So there are a lot of benefits to mixing and matching Windows Forms and WPF in the same application. There are a number of scenarios we'll look at. The first one we'll look at is using Windows Forms in WPF applications. You can add an existing Windows form to a WPF application. And all you need to do is add some references to assemblies that Windows Forms requires. You can also create a new Windows form in a WPF application, and then Visual Studio will add the references to the needed assemblies for you. And then Visual Studio will open the Windows form in the Windows Forms Designer. And the toolbox shows Windows Forms controls. So just because you've created a WPF application doesn't mean that you can't open existing or create brand new Windows Forms. Now there are some interoperability issues at runtime. The most important one you'll face is keyboard input, because it turns out that messages are received by the host application and then routed to the appropriate window or form. So when you press keys, a message is sent to the Windows system that you've pressed a key. Well, it turns out that a WPF application can't route keyboard input to a Windows form by default. But you can solve this problem by using the Windows Forms host class, and we'll see how to do that in the demo. The other issue concerns visual styles. WPF applications don't enable visual styles by default. So if you're running Windows XP, then you'd need to enable visual styles so your Windows Forms look better. If you're running Windows Vista or Windows 7, this is a completely moot point. But if you're running Windows XP, then you'll want to turn on visual styles. So let's go see how to add Windows Forms to a WPF application. In this demo, I'm going to create a brand new WPF application, and this application will have both WPF Windows and Windows Forms. So I'll create a new project, and this is going to be a WPF application, and I will put it in my Documents folder because I don't want to overwrite the existing version of this, which is in the Samples folder. So I'm going to call this Interop Demo 1. And here's my main window. I'm just going to make a couple housekeeping changes here. This is Interop Demo 1. I don't need it to be more than 300 wide, and Personally, I like all my windows to show up in the center of the screen. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this application is I'm going to display customers' information. So let me create my first window. I'm going to add a new window, and I will call it Customers. And the title is Customers. I need this to be about 500 by 500, and then again, it's got to show up in the center of the screen. Alright, perfect. So that's that for now. Let's go back to the main window. This is the application's main window. What appears here? I want buttons to open up the customers window. I want to be able to log in. I'm going to have an about form, etc. So I want to add that. And I don't want to type that XAML because it already exists. So let me go to the finished version of this, which is Interop Demo 1, and let me grab main window.xaml, and let me just get at the stack panel with the buttons. Okay, so through the magic of copy and paste, now here's my UI. I can log in, I'll have a customers window and a customers form and an about window. And because I copied and pasted this, the event handlers aren't created. So I'll navigate to Event Handler. I would love it if there was a button you could right-click and it said Create All Event Handlers, and then it would parse my code and create all of them for me. That would save me huge amounts of time. Okay, so Customers window. So now, var customers equal new customers, and then customers.show. Alright, excellent. Now, what else do I want? I want to be able to log in, and I want an about window. And being an old Windows Forms hand myself, I know that Windows Forms provides me with a template to create a new about box. So I just want to use that. So I'll add a new item, and then I'll select Windows Forms, and I'll select About Box. And I'm going to call this About Form. And I will click Add, and Visual Studio opens this Windows form in the Windows Forms Designer, and it added for me references to system.drawing and system.windows.forms that are required by the Windows Forms Designer. And now notice, when I open up the toolbox, I can see Windows Forms controls. So if I open up Customers, this is the WPF Designer. Here are the WPF controls. And then if I switch over to the Windows Forms Designer, here are the Windows Forms controls. And I can modify this, so I can change properties. I want the text to be about form, and I'm used to dealing with these in alphabetical order. I can change the width. Let's make the width a little wider, 520. That's better. And the start position in center screen. And then I can actually even write code in here. This dot close. Okay. Now, what about the login form? Well, C# doesn't provide me with a login form, but I have an existing one that I created, so let me add that to this project. I'm going to add an existing item, and I'm going to go to the samples folder, to interoperability, to existing forms in Windows, and I'm going to grab loginform.cs. I'll add that. Now when I double click on this, give it a second. Now when I double click on it, it opens it up in the Windows Forms Designer. And so here's my login form ready to go. And in the code, I can close. Okay, now back to main window.xaml. So let's write the code to open up the login. You would think login form would show up here. Maybe I got to build first. Var login equals new login. Oh, I bet it doesn't show up. I wonder if this is a namespace issue? Of course, it's a namespace issue. When I created this, I created it in the namespace Windows Forms Application 1. Now I'm moving this over into Interop Demo 1. So let's just rename that namespace to Interop Demo 1. Do it. Okay. So now there's login form. Hooray. And login.show. I won't have this problem with the about because I created it here. About form and about.show. Okay, save my changes, build, and now let's run this. It's a WPF application that has a WPF window and a Windows form and another Windows form. And with this desktop theme, you can hardly tell the difference. Now, if I had a more colorful, more modern theme, then you might be able to tell the difference, but actually for this it's hard to tell which of these is the Windows form and which is the WPF window. Okay, so I have both windows and forms in this application. If you think about it, you would expect that because a WPF window is a class and a Windows form is a class, and classes are classes. Now yes, Windows forms use a different graphical subsystem than WPF, but as far as the .NET framework at runtime, that shouldn't matter in terms of having both of these in the same application. They're just classes. So it makes total sense that we could have both in here. And then Visual Studio is smart enough to open the Windows Forms designer if I open a Windows form, and the XAML designer if I open a XAML window. So now these windows and forms can coexist at the same time. Can they share information? So what I want is when the user logs in, I want to be able to store their username and use it throughout the application. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a class. And I'm going to call this statics. And I will make it a public static class. And inside, I'm going to have a public static string login name equal to string.empty. All right, good. Now, in the login form, when the user logs in before they exit, before they exit, I'm going to say statics.loginname equals username text box.text. So let's record what the username is. And then back in the main window, I'm going to modify this code here. And I'm going to say if login, rather than show, I'm going to show this as a dialog. And then if that is equal to system.windows.forms.dialog result dot OK, then message box dot show welcome statics dot login name. Beautiful. All right, save it. Build it. Build it, I said. And run it. So now I log in. It's my username, Robert. Enter my password. Welcome, Robert. So obviously the two classes can share information even though they're using different graphical subsystems. So this is a pretty simple WPF application that uses both Windows Forms and WPF Windows and shares information. Let's do something a little bit more useful with it. Let's display customers' data. Let's clean up some of this. So on the customers window, I want to display customers. So I'm going to create a data source and do some drag and drop data binding. I'm going to keep this nice and simple, and I'm going to use a data set. And I'll create a new connection to my favorite database, which of course is Northwind. SQL Express. There's Northwind. And then I'm just going to grab the customers table. And we're done. And I'm going to drag customers from the data sources window onto the form. Visual Studio 2010 adds drag and drop data binding for WPF. I never tire of saying that. And let's see what it added. It added a data grid. Visual Studio added a collection view source, which is bound to the customers table in the Northwind dataset. And then Visual Studio added some code to call the fill method of the customers table adapter, and then go and grab a reference to this resource, customers view source, which is already wired up to be bound to the customers table in the Northwind dataset, and therefore my window is bound to customers, and when I open the customers window, I'll see my customers in a data grid. Now what happens if I have a Windows form in here and I want to display data? Well, let's add a new window, and now a new Windows form, excuse me, and I'll call this customers form. Okay, let's do a little bit of maintenance here. This says customers, should show up in the center of the screen. Should probably be a little bigger. Oh, let's say 400 by 400. Perfect. Now let's go to the data sources window, and let's drag and drop these as details rather than a data grid, just as a change of pace. And so we get text boxes, data bound text boxes. Perfect. Then when we click the button to launch this, let's not forget to add that. Var customers form equals new customers form, and customers form dot show. Okay. Perfect. Now let's run this. If I click customers window, I get a WPF window that shows customers, and if I click customers form, I get a Windows form that shows customers. I can scroll back and forth, I can scroll back and forth. I'm pretty happy. I can use the arrow key to go up and down in the customers. I can click in here and press the tab key, and nothing happens. The problem is that keyboard input messages are received by the host application, which is WPF. So when I'm over here and I press the up arrow, that sends a message to the WPF application that says the user pressed the up arrow. and the WPF application passes that information onto the customer's window and says, up arrow is pressed. You go and do whatever it is you do when someone presses the up arrow. So keyboard input works great in here. But when I'm over in the Windows form and I press the Tab key, there's a keyboard input message that gets sent to the WPF application. The WPF application, actually the runtime, says I need to pass that to the current window, but it's a Windows form and I don't know how to do that, so I'll just eat it. So the Windows form never gets the message that I pressed the Tab key. Happily, the fix for this is very straightforward. I need to add a reference, so I will add a reference in the .NET tab to Windows Forms Integration, because that contains a class I need to fix this. And I want this fix to be at the application level, not at each individual form level. So I'm going to add a startup event handler here. And what I'm going to do is the system.windows.forms.Windows Forms host. This element gives you the ability to host a Windows Forms control on a WPF page. So it handles the interop of where you're having Windows Forms and Windows Forms controls inside the WPF application. And I'm going to call the enable Windows Forms interop method. And now, to enable visual styles, I'm going to say system.windows.forms.application.enable visual styles. Now I'm running on Windows 7, so this is a moot point because Windows Forms adopt the visual style on Windows 7 or Windows Vista. But if I was running this on XP, then my Windows Forms wouldn't adopt the visual style, and so this would cause them to. So this line of code right here is going to solve our keyboard issue. So now let's run this. I open up the customer's window, and of course I can still move around because this is a WPF window, but now when I call the customer's form and press the Tab key, it works exactly as you would expect it to, and I can start changing data and typing and do everything I need to. So this one line of code here solves the keyboard issue and gives me the ability to create a WPF application that contains both Windows Forms and WPF Windows and have them happily coexist. You just saw how to add Windows Forms to WPF applications. Now let's look at the flip side. You can add an existing WPF window to a Windows Forms application. You just need to add references to the assemblies that WPF needs. And you can create a new WPF window in a Windows Forms application, and once again, Visual Studio adds the references you need. And of course, Visual Studio opens WPF windows in the XAML Designer, and the toolbox shows WPF controls. And there are interoperability issues. Again, the keyboard input issue. A Windows Forms application can't route keyboard input to a WPF window by default. And so you address this by using the element host class, which is similar to the Windows Forms host class that we used in the previous demo. Now, Windows Forms applications enable visual styles by default, so if you're running on XP, there's no issue. This was only an issue if you had Windows Forms in a WPF application. So let's go see how to add WPF windows to Windows Forms applications. So what I want to do is add a WPF window to give me the ability to view customer information and to view the number of customers in each office. This Windows form shows me the offices. There's nothing in there, but that's what it does. and then I want a window to show customers. Then I want to see the number of customers in each office. All right, let's add a new item to this project. I want to add a WPF window. So again, I'm in a Windows Forms application. I come down to WPF and notice that I can't add a new WPF window. But what I can do is add a new WPF user control. But I'm not going to do that now. I want to add a window. So what you'd have to do is create the window in a WPF application, and then you can add it as an existing window into the Windows Forms application. So I'm going to add an existing item, and this existing item is in the existing Forms and Windows folder, and it's Office. And this is a class that defines what an office is. Offices have location and a number of customers. Now, for the window I wanted, go to Existing Items and select XAML Files, and here's my customers window. And now when I open this, and remember I'm in a Windows Forms application, but I double-click on the XAML file, Visual Studio opens up the XAML editor. I also want the Customers by Office XAML file, so I'm going to add that as well. So now let's open up Customers by Office. And we can take a look at the XAML in this. We've got a data template, we've got a text block which is going to show the location, and then it's going to say customers, and then I've got two bindings to customers. I've got a text block and a rectangle. So what this is going to do is show me the office, the number of customers, and then a rectangle in red that is as wide as the customers. Okay, so there are my two WPF windows. Let's go into the main form. When I double-click customers, I'll save our customers equal new customers. And then customers dot, oh, look at that, show, ooh, that's interesting. I don't want to generate a method stub. Interop demo2.customers does not contain a definition for show. What the heck? When have you ever seen this? A window doesn't contain a definition for show? How can this be? Well, it can be because Visual Studio has the ability to show this window at design time, but the application does not have the ability to show the window at runtime. And the reason is because I don't have the references that are required by WPF. I only have in this application the references that Windows Forms requires. And there are a handful of assemblies that WPF needs. I have two choices here. I can go find out what references I need and add them one at a time by hand. Actually, I have a better idea. Here's what we do. We take a shortcut. We go into the design view. We go to the toolbox. And we take any control, drag it onto the window, and when we let go, watch what happens in the references. Bam! Visual Studio adds accessibility, presentation core, presentation framework, presentation UI, system.xaml, UI automation provider, UI automation types, and Windows base. And then all I do is come back here and get rid of that label because I don't want it. And now I can show this. And then we'll want to do the same thing for customers by office. Var customers by office equals new customers by office. And customers by office dot show. Now it shows up in IntelliSense. Life is good. Now if I hadn't done it in the previous demo, I would show you how to do drag and drop data binding onto this WPF window, but you've seen it over and over again, so let's just assume that it's done. We'll pretend it's done. So now let me build this and run this, and remember this is a Windows Forms application. Offices display in the Windows form, customers display in the WPF window, and customers by office displays in this WPF window. Here's offices, the number of customers, and then I get a rectangle that's as wide as the number of customers. And that's really easy to do in WPF, not that easy to do in Windows Forms. So this would be a good example of adding functionality to a Windows Forms application more easily by just adding a XAML window. Okay, so I actually should have dragged customers on there because I need to show interoperability issues. So let me do that anyway. Let's add a data source, connect to Northwind, grab customers, and let's drag it onto this window as details, so we get text boxes. And we don't have to write any code because we're using data sets. Visual Studio writes the code for us. So now let's run this. And now when we call up customers, here are the customers, and I cannot tab from text box to text box. So the exact same issue. I press tab, the Windows Forms application receives that message and it can't pass it on to the WPF window. So the fix is really similar to the way we fixed this in the previous demo. We need a reference, so I'm going to add a reference again to Windows Forms integration, the same Windows Forms integration we used in the previous example. And then I'm going to go into main form CS, and I'm going to do this. After I create my customers field, I'm going to say system.windows.forms.integration.element host, and this is the Windows Forms control that can be used to host WPF elements. So this is the flip side of Windows Forms host. Windows Forms host says you can have Windows Forms in a WPF application. Element host says you can have WPF elements in a Windows application. And then I enable modeless keyboard interop, and I pass the window, which is customers. And then I have to do this for every time I open a window. In the previous example, we were able to basically set this once and turn it on for the entire application, but here you have to do it at the window by window level. So now I run this, and now I can tab around to my heart's content, as well as type and make changes.